Hey, I'm Zane. I'm going to talk about the real value of Oracle help checks. This is for the New York Oracle Users Group, and a special thank you for NYOUG for their event promotions. We've also got other upcoming webinars that will be going on, so please keep an eye on their website, our website, and take a look at it to your schedule. For those of you unfamiliar with New York Oracle Users Group, welcome. There will be some additional information out there on how to connect later in the presentation with them at the end of the webinar. I am Zane Warton. I have about 20 years of Oracle DBA experience. I've been involved with multiple roles and industries. I'm OCP certified. I have a master's in information systems, and I lead part of the Oracle team that where we deliver Oracle services to many dozens of clients. Datavail has been a database services for over 13 years. They started out primarily supporting Oracle and SQL Server. They were formed by database administrators. We had other new technologies like Mongo, Postgres, and we've expanded quite a lot in the last 15 years or 13 years. Heard you just stopped by. Do we have a booth? I assume we have a booth. Okay. Jenna, you were going to mention about our survey?
Yes, absolutely. Thanks, Zane. It wouldn't be a Datavail webinar without a giveaway. Datavail is trying to learn more about organizations, cloud adoptions, and usage for different workloads. And as part of this, we'd like you to take part in a cloud adoption survey that we've launched through Tech Validate, an independent surveyor. Please use the link in the slide to complete. I'll also add this to our chat function shortly so you have access, and we'll be selecting a winner from today's webinar to win a work from home package that includes a Datavail mask, noise canceling headphones, a hoodie, insulated cup, and a Sherpa blanket. Make sure you get it filled out today so that we have your answers. Thanks, Zane, back to you.
Thanks. Okay, our agenda for today, I'm going to start out with some bad advice, as I usually do. And we'll talk about when health checks aren't performed, why they might be important, what should be in a health check, some other best practices, and I'll go through kind of some examples of what we provide and how to, a little bit on how we gather that data, and then some final thoughts. So first of all, some bad advice. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. Everyone has heard this. A lot of times they're wrong. Sometimes it is broke, or sometimes it could always use a little bit of work. You might be too busy. You know who set it up, and they do great work. And if you don't get any complaints, how can you have any problems? And if you're not getting any alerts, it means no problems. All those things could indicate some kind of a miss. So what happens when health checks aren't performed? Hidden issues could lead to database crashes or long delays in dashboard updates. Socrates said that the unexamined life is not worth living. And I say the unexamined database can lead to trouble. Might have difficulty logging in, security intrusions that you don't notice. You might not get complaints from database users, which might indicate that a lot of times they'll be doing some sort of strange strange behavior where they're clicking twice on different buttons or doing some other kind of strange activity to avoid a problem on the database. And sometimes talking to your users can help you find those issues and track them down. You never know, if you're using some features you shouldn't be using, or you're not, your backups aren't quite as in line. You might be hit with a fine for failure to comply. And if you lose any data, of course, that's always loss of time to either recover it or recreate it, or sometimes it's not even recoverable. All this can lead you to some sort of a DBA hell, and you don't want to be there. Organizational change is constant, and your priorities are often fluid. There's a lot of things that you need to keep track of in your world, just like everybody. Project work world, reorgs, lots of staff. You're firefighting from one problem to the other, budget issues. All these things can get in the way of performing regular health checks. And any complicated system, even if it's on RDS or anything, requires maintenance to ensure good performance. You want to be proactive as much as you can and not as reactive. So health check should be your first step in database planning. It gives you a nice baseline to work with where you can go back to your health check document and look at it and see, hey, how was this set up before? Or are there any issues there that showed up in the health check? It helps you plan. It's an excellent place to just refer to. It's like, where are we storing backups or something? You might live in a complex environment with multiple systems or multiple database varieties. Sometimes it's hard to keep track, and having sort of health tech documentation can really help. Diagnostic tools and vendors are available to help you with these things. AWR, Statspack, if you don't have the licensing for AWR. AWR, for those you might not know, is Oracle's automated workload repository. You can run reports off that that you can look at. We'll be looking through a couple of those. Help you fill out the content for your health check. Recently, Oracle has renamed their sort of check software again. It's now called the Autonomous Health Framework. I knew it mostly as DB Check from years ago, but there's Oracle's Doc ID if you want to look up more details about that. Later on, we'll be also glancing at one of those to show what kind of information it has. What should it include? A health check. If you are kind of outsourcing this to help you with your health checks, make sure that you're using one with a strong track record. They're going to have access to all your data. It's pretty much impossible to do the health check without looking at the system as a whole. At Datavail, we have a custom assessment developed by our team where we do major annual health checks for our own folks that we support and for others. Bi-weekly mini checks, and you want to make sure it's a comprehensive check of both your OS and database system. Some of the things we check, is there a supported version of Oracle? Has it been patched? What's the current patch level? You want to make sure you get that written down in there. Make sure an SP file is in use. SP files allow you to make changes on the fly in an Oracle database instance. Some of those changes take effect immediately. Other changes need a bounce, but either way, it's nice to be able to write those changes to that SP file. So when it does bounce, it picks up those changes right away. And you'd be surprised to find how many systems think they're using SP files and they're not. That's one of the things we check. You want to make sure you're using your space utilization, how you expect to be using it. Check your file system, whether or not it's regular or ASM. Check your tablespace critical and warning thresholds. You want to kind of have a snapshot in time of your size utilization, so it'll help you do analysis later on. Want to check your memory sizes, make sure those are recorded. Sometimes systems are completely wiped out. You want to restore them for backups, but you don't have that. Well, how was that system actually set up, a year ago or whatever? It's nice to have the health checks to figure that out. Object size, just your largest objects, things like that. Make sure you understand what's in your database, and a health check can help you understand that. You also want to check backups. They should be easy to find. They should be on a different mount point or drive than other different systems. We get calls from people who say, hey, my database is down. We need help. It's like, oh, where are your backups? So it was on the save drive that broke. You don't want to be that person. Backups should also be removed to a tape system or a virtual tape library so that they are stored offsite in case of a full disaster. And make sure that there's some sort of rotation going on, so things are going on site, but still maybe older ones are still there to recover from, but you don't want everything in the same place. I know that OCI and other instances, or AWS, have S3 sort of remote NFS mount points or bucket storage you can use for backups. That's a great solution if you don't want to work with a tape library company. Use RMAN or another industry standard tool. RMAN was a little dicey in the beginning. But that was 20 years ago. Everything's hunky-dory now. RMAN's an excellent tool to use and manage your backups. Your restore feature should be tested regularly, and you should know how it works. That should be documented. It can be in health check, but it should be documented nonetheless. And that you got to make sure your backups are per your DR standards. So whatever you tell your customers, your clients that, hey, we're keeping backup for 2 weeks or one backup every 6 months or whatever your backup things, just your backup settings are, make sure that they actually agree with what you say they are. Make sure so for the file system, make sure you have adequate space for database growth, that generally for using flat file systems, that they're 20% larger to allow for space growth in the near term, and that the OS is installed on its own drive and mount point. It's not sharing files. That keeps your database from interfering with your OS and your OS interfering from your database. And if your backups are on a different mount point, pretty much you want everything as isolated as you can from each other, just so that we all play in our safe spaces without interference. You want to go through and check performance issues and make sure they're part of there. You want to check redo logs, duplicate SQL issues, stats gathering, invalid objects. It's a good idea to include some performance information, like take a look at your weight table, see if there's anything funny in there. Your alert log trace files, at least partial contents of those, you should scan those for errors. Sometimes your alarming set up in a way that you're not going to catch some unique verbiage or terminology, or maybe your alarms aren't set up right. So having a periodic check of your entire systems can help you kind of root out those errors so they don't cause problems later. You should look over your jobs and DBMS jobs, and also your scheduler jobs, to see if those are causing issues or maybe taking longer than you expect them to. Sort of mapping out what's there is really important as part of a health check process. Security issues. Maybe your users' accounts are assigned to the wrong kind of table spaces. You want to make sure that they are where you expect them to be, that you don't have folks assigned to the system or SysOx table space where they should be in users or have their own independent one table space. You want to check through the user accounts. Do they have privileges that are properly assigned? Does everybody have DBA privileges? That's usually often a shortcut to make sure users can do just certain things. So you tend to over assign privileges occasionally. You want to try to avoid that. And also dormant accounts, so accounts that haven't been logged into for a year. Maybe that's passwords written on some sticky note somewhere in some office. You want to make sure those are locked down or removed. And certainly you want to know they're there. That's not something an alarming system is ever going to find. It's not something a user's ever going to find just sitting out there on its own. You want to check failed logins. Maybe they're not meeting your threshold, or maybe you don't have a threshold for your failed login alerts. You want to check to see, are those going on? Take a look at your listener log and such to see if there's anything in there unexpected. So best practice recommendations. You should consolidate it's nice enough to look through everything, go through a checklist and stuff, but it's best to consolidate these into reports and interpret that data for clear recommendations. You want to have a nice summary. You want to have you want to summarize that data in a way you can read it, and have easily English written grammar and stuff, so that you want to make sure that people can understand. If a non-DBA were to read your report, they should be able to read the report and have some basic understanding of it, in case you aren't the one that's going to be there to deal with an issue, you're on vacation or something. These should be a snapshot in time, include as many configuration settings as you can, your performance snapshot, and your current size. So for frequency, for high stress, high turnover, agile environments, you might be doing these monthly. Might be doing these quarterly from sort of the normal growing user base, growing data, but not anything crazy. And semi-annually for non-growing steady, if you've got some older systems that are stuck on 11G or something like that, you might not do that. So we're going to talk about some examples. Let me change what I'm sharing. Sorry for the delay. Okay, so here's an example of, I hope everybody can see that. This is an example of what we do. This is sort of like I've pulled out all the company information I could find. And this is basically the write-up of kind of a normal instance. We're going to have, you want to, say out there straight up that, this is an assessment report. Somebody knows what looked at, the file's named correctly. There's a date on the file name, stuff like that. What server it's running on at the time, the date, and who did it. You want to go through here. We've got quite a lot of pages. Starts over the summary. So for this particular instance, everything was looking pretty healthy, but I had some concerns with configuration, patching, backups, and security. And then at the top of it, we go through all the different recommendations for all the different settings and make comments about each one. So in this case, and the way this report overall is generated is we have a set of scripts we run. It creates a bunch of JSON files. We feed that into another database and then spit out this Word doc. And then we go back and we edit this later on. I mean, it's fine to have an automated process, but you need to add to it to make sure that, what you're saying, it makes sense. So we go back through and we add other data to this document to make sure it works. And stuff like the backup history and stuff like that, you're not going to necessarily ever be able to automate that piece of it. So anyway, it goes through and talks about patching first. It says, hey, this database, last had a release update from 2019. This was a 2020 report, so this patch was a little behind. So we recommend to do the patch. It looks like the recent stats runs, and it says, hey, these were stopped or failed for some reason. You want to check to see what tables might be missing stats or what's wrong with this process. You might adjust the windows associated or create tickets to do so, or maybe you don't do any of that. You just record this here and recognize that it might be something to keep an eye on later on. We go through and look at all the schemas. This notes the amount of invalid objects out there. Those you can attempt to recompile these. If you notice in this one, there's lots that have the same views that are invalid. It might be because a major object behind the scenes has changed and affected views across multiple schemas. Again, you may have alarming associated with invalid objects. Usually there's a ton around. So knowing that they're there is useful for tracking down perhaps future issues or changes. Here are all the different users that have the DBA role. That's not usually appropriate. This is called out. Sometimes, there are reasons behind it, usually because folks are too lazy to narrow down on the particular views, or maybe they actually are doing some kind of function that requires DBA role. Probably not, probably can be cleaned up, but at least you want it documented here. File system mount information. I want to make sure that if they do have less space than the maximum amount of auto extend, that you're sort of aware of that you might have to move files around. You might go through and adjust your auto extending values so that you're not going to over allocate anything. So a lot of this stuff is just things to be aware of. This particular database is not using OMF and had duplicate data file names. That might become to an issue if you're consolidating disk drives and you're moving around data files. You might find that, oh, whoops, I didn't want to do that. Or you might overwrite your file name unintentionally and corrupt your data, or just lose sections of your tables, and that's not good. These are all the different operations and no logging. This database was using sort of an ad hoc version of DataGuard. So if you're doing no logging operations and those operations are not being passed through the redo logs, and you want to make sure that you're aware of that they wouldn't have to be rebuilt if you failed over to your failover system. We also check for duplicate SQL. So basically, these are SQL statements that are very similar to each other. But so whatever program is behind them, was it using bind variables, and would often and maybe these are SQLs that are a good case for bind variables that might lower the parse rate associated with, can affect your performance. If you're constantly parsing SQL, that's all unique. Maybe that's a bad idea. Just kind of depends. Memory configuration, basically it's like the current status of how much free memory we have on the box. Is it over allocated or under allocated? Just helps you be aware. It has the DB cache advice, and I'll show you where I get this table from in a little bit. Basically, this is Oracle's advice on what would happen if you doubled the size of the SGA, or in this case, the DB cache. How much performance would you improve, or is there an opportunity to cut back space? Take all these reports with a grain of salt, because Oracle will eat all your memory if you let it. You just have to, try, experiment. If you do reset these settings, you can run your tests and see if it actually is doing the improvement you expected, and go back. Some environments are more permissive about that up, and others kind of depends. Then we look for common parameters that are changed, or that might be set better, or have more beneficial settings. For instance, in this case, it's file system IO options. That's something that we tend to look at all our instances to see if that's set, if it's appropriate. We have a whole list here, but this was the only one that sort of showed up in this particular instance. Then I delve into performance data. So this database was using Statspack to, or didn't have AWR licensing. So I ran a number of Statspack reports over a number of weeks, and just kind of looked at the DB time, looked at many of the reports, sort of had an automated tool to run through Statspack reports. And then kind of looked over typically the top weights. In each of these reports, they're going to have the top 5 timed events. You go in and look and see what they are, and I put an example of that in here. So, if you are using this as a reference point for the far future, you go back, well, what are my normal weights? And if suddenly you notice that, hey, I'm used to be getting average weight of 4 milliseconds for writes to temp, or DB file reads are pretty slow, this gives you a point of reference to compare later. So maybe your storage, there's an issue with your storage subsystem that you're not aware of. And you're getting 11 millisecond waits. This top 5 time event switches all around. Your health check gives you a chance to look back at something like this and say, oh, this is how it should perform, or how it performed at one point. You can also do this kind of thing for baseline AWR reports, that sort of thing. But this is a system that didn't have the performance and tuning license, so we were unable to do that here. I also tend to record the top SQL. This is just organized by various different categories. This is by rows processed, by CPU, by buffer gets, by disk reads, elapsed time. This gives you the SQL IDs of various SQL statements, and you can go in here and look and see, hey, I'm experiencing problems. If you suddenly have, and this is normal operation, maybe in the future you go through and check these your SQLs and notice that, hey, I've got a completely different setup here. So did we have major application changes, or is there another problem with statistics or something that's throwing us off? If you don't have recorded like information like this, you don't know. And then after the analysis section is complete, we always have a raw data capture. So the next, I don't know, 50, 40 pages, 35 pages of this report are all basically raw data that's fed in here. And for instance, here's all the different non-default parameters of the instance. More detailed patching information about when the patches have happened in the past, what your gather stats windows are in case there are changes, the full history of the recent stats, so you can see, okay, it is running or not running. Again, some of the information from the top might be repeated down here if because this is raw data rather than commented on. We don't necessarily comment on everything down here, but it's all here recorded. All the data file names and the different mount points. And let's see, obviously this fills up 30 pages very quickly. These guys had a lot of data files. Also checking for excessive redo log switches. So if you're getting a lot of switching, that could indicate either a lot of churn or maybe your redo logs are incorrectly sized and might be resized. Excuse me. Some information on the redo logs tells some things, and then some of the backup history. And this is where you check to see if your backups are matching what you expect they are. Make sure that data file has last backup. So you check the dates here to see if anything here was off. Actually, our process calls us out to the top if there's anything really off. And no logging operations, and back to the SQL at the end. So that's an example of our what one of our final reports looks like. So for some other examples, of where we get some of this data, I'm just going to share my desktop in general. Okay, so one of the things we can, one of the processes we run that I was mentioning earlier, something we call a mini check, which is basically we have a DB check system. It's basically a bunch of canned SQL. If I type in list, it shows all the different SQL that we have canned. This allows all of our team members to kind of run the same SQL statements, put this in all the systems so that we can easily get in here and kind of run the same statement, have something you can easily cut and paste from. So, you know, DBAs will typically have their own set of scripts that they run. And this just gives us a uniform way to do it. And, you know, folks can add their own scripts if they feel that they are appropriate. So a mini check is basically something we drop into a ticket. We check, you know, usually by monthly or something like that, that we'll go through here and, you know, says, hey, well, this is what the database is, database name, what host it was, time, things like that. It sort of does a pre-check on table spaces with usually more, I suppose, generous or more restrictive sizes, just so that might have some pre-warning. Hey, this database is, you know, maybe does an alarm till 96% or something. This kind of gives you a heads up, so you can go out here and fix this if you think that's appropriate to fix, which might save you from getting a ticket later on, and such. Checks the recycle bin for excessive stuff that may be removed, maybe that needs to be cleaned up. Checks for log switching that might have happened recently that you're worried about. And we'll check other things that may not show up in reports. Some of those things are, for instance, stale stats, invalid objects. I mean, some of the same things that we check on our larger report, but this is sort of a mini version. Objects with stale stat, or I already said stale stats, unusable indexes, maybe, you know, for materialized views or something. Indexes often get marked unusable because they've been rebuilt or the objects have been moved. That may not, depending on what alarming you're using, may not trigger an alarm, but it's good to check that periodically just in case. And other job schedulers and failures. Check that out. So one of the things we talked about running is sort of the next version is a Statspack report. Statspack, you install, it basically comes on all versions of Oracle's that I'm aware of, going back in time, even more currently. It sets up a job, takes an hourly snapshots, kind of just takes all the weight tables and copies it over to the perfstat schema, if that's use the default schema, and we'll give you a more detailed report. And you can go in here and use this to kind of generate your other report. You can take, if you're just doing this, if you don't have the whole JSON thing that we use, this, you know, you can save this report as part of a report package or include this in the Word doc, or just cut and paste from this for what you see might be important. But Out here, it tells you how the system's set up, memory on the system, when the snap period occurred, how much time. DB time is the overall measurement of weights that a system has. So if your DB time is way higher than your lapse time, you kind of know that your database might be pretty busy. That's not necessarily a bad sign of overactivity. It just kind of depends on your system. So if you do these health checks, you kind of get a sense of, hey, this is my DB time and this is the norm, and when is it out of the norm. It talks about the different load profiles of different operations. Let's see what else is in here. Your buffer hits, we used to be concerned about that, not quite as much anymore. And then there's these top 5 timed events that I showed you in the other report. So basically saying, hey, this is, what is my database spending its time on? Sometimes these are older. I think these particular ones might be a little bit older idle events. You have to update Statspack with they constantly added other idle events that Oracle is watching itself do. Focus on instant CPU, memory settings, various other stats. It's a very wordy report. I encourage you to use Google if you want to try to read through these things. Usually each of these things you can go and look up individually or kind of get a sense for them over time. AWR reports a little bit easier to read, mostly because they're HTML, but have a lot of the same content. See, somewhere in here is, what else did I say? So the SQL's breakdown here. So it says, this isn't quite the same report I used to pull out the SQL just because the other one's a little more compressed. But you can certainly use this where it goes through and has the hash values of SQLs. Hey, what has your database been doing? Here's the top SQL for executions, ordered by gets, order all by these different things. What's going on so that you can save these for your reports. Let's see, somewhere in here is the cache advice. And that's what I was going to show you. I can show you in the other report too. Different IO stats. This gives you IO performance for all the different table spaces. If you've got hot objects that are that are hitting a particular table space, you might want to move those to other table spaces. It just just kind of depends on your world. I think generally with Oracle, every answer is it depends, and you go through the details. Maybe that's all answers. Here's the buffer pool advisory that I was talking about before. Basically, this 1.0 setting is your current setting. So in this case, it's 480 megs. And this is an example database I have in a virtual box, so it's not gonna. But even here, it kind of says, well, if you doubled your memory to 960, then you would have many more thousands of buffers. Your physical reads might go from a factor of 1 to a factor of 0.3, so a third. And our reads would drop down, which could probably improve your performance. But with all these settings, maybe it won't. It kind of depends on the nature of your application, your SQL, other activity. Sometimes increasing memory or changing parameters will make things faster. Sometimes if they get too big, sometimes Oracle has a little bit of trouble trying to balance things out if there's too big a size here. Okay. Let's see if there's anything else I want to say about this AWR report. To run one of these reports, I can show you that really quick. You log in as the PerfStat user, and you refer to your Oracle home with that question mark. It's in RDBS admin, and it's just SP report, if you can spell report. brings up all the recent snapshots. You'll see gaps in these areas. These gaps indicate when the system was bounced. And you would select the beginning snapshot period, the ending snapshot period, and it would spit out the report right there. And it also drops it to a file so you can download it and check it later. And it has all the basic same contents that I went through right there. Let's see. So the next thing to look at is an AWR report. AWR reports can be run either through OEM if you have access to that, or they can be run by script. Let's see, if you want to run it by script, I have a shortcut script here that basically is running same thing, RDMS admin, AW report. It looks very similar, where you can say what report type you want, and you ask like number of days, which is how many days back you want to see it, and then you could click on the snap IDs, which this only has one because it was down recently. But if I chose prior days, you'd see a similar list to how you just saw for the stats packs to see all the different snapshots. Anyway, so same sort of thing as we saw in the PerfStat report. You've got your basic database information at the top, and then your top findings from ADDM. This is the Diagnostic Diagnosis Manager. I can't remember what these things always mean, which basically points out, this is Oracle's automated health check sort of process that goes through and sees where it would offer to improve things, and it usually always finds some sort of problem. You can run an ADM report just like you run a AWR report. Maybe we'll look at one of those if we have time. And it basically talks about what SQL you could look at. These are useful to look at over a particular problem time period. It will offer, say, hey, you had a problem with IO performance, it was markedly wrong or whatever. Anyway, sort of the same thing. So it goes through and talks about efficiency percentages of, how often you're, if it's in memory sort. Memory sorts is sorting in memory rather than sorting in your temp table space when you're doing a large query, or perhaps an index rebuild, something like that. And it goes top ground or top foreground events by wait time. It will go through and break out all the different things that's going on. This does a little bit better with those idle events. So you can go through and say, hey, my top wait is CPU. So that's usually kind of like the report I just saw, commenting that if most of your waits are CPU, that's probably pretty good. And it breaks out all the different wait times. You'd save this report, or at least snatches of this report that you are cut and paste tables from this report into your document if you've got it available, to kind of give you that snapshot that we've talked about a bunch of times. Down here, it's nice, it's all HTML enabled. You can go and click on your SQL statistics and see all these ordered by the elapsed time, CPU time. You can then click further on the SQL statement itself, and it will bring up what the statement was from before. Hit back to go back. It orders them by a lot of different things that you might not see. And it also captures the init or parameters. This is something you just cut and paste from here and drop into your other report. But again, the value of that written report is that you are going in and actually adding analysis to it. I mean, you could just capture AWR reports, but after a while, those become, rote, where you're just, capturing them out there and you're not necessarily reviewing them like you should. And actually, here is the ADM task report itself. I forgot these were in here. So this is from the same snapshot period. It will go in here and basically it drops down at the bottom of the AW report for you, which is nice, and goes through in here and tells you what Oracle's internal logic thinks is the finding and recommendations. I wouldn't necessarily include these in a health check, by themselves, Oracle will usually always find a problem with, not necessarily a problem, but figure out whatever the top SQL thing is appropriate. Let's see. We'll be done in about 5 minutes. All right, so the last thing we're going to talk about is Oracle's DB check. Now, this is part of the, or currently part of the TFA utility. It is installed. If you usually you can install it as Oracle, but it's usually best to install it root. Gives you more access to this thing, and then you can run the DB check, which it's probably gonna take longer to run than we have time for. Oops, not DB check, or check, which goes out there and analyzes your database. I don't know if we're gonna have time for it to come back. This is a very small system, so it tends to be a little slower on this system. We'll come back to it. Anyway, at the end, it generates, you basically go through and choose how you want to run it, and it generates a zip file you can download on your desktop or send to Oracle if there's an issue or something. And it gives you a nice index page you can go in and click on. And this brings you to this health check report. So this is even nicer than the ADM reports because it's even further web enabled. It goes through here and tells you same sort of information, where it ran, things like that. It's got these nice things. You can click, hey, I want to see the critical alerts, I want to see failures, I want to see warnings, and it will basically do a great job kind of filling out these pieces. And then you're saying, hey, this should use automatic space management, and View will go through and explain what's going on, why it thinks you should use it, and usually gives you some other links to follow up on if you're curious. And you can go through at each little thing. Hey, it actually calls out each of the Oracle patches that might not be installed in this instance and say, and will give you details about why this particular patch is recommended by Oracle. And you can see basically what's going on, gives you an Oracle note to also follow up on if you're interested. Recommends watching OS or launching OS Watcher, which is Oracle's tool to sort of monitor the OS and file system and the CPU disk performance. Gives you some fairly nice graphs, or at least some graphs that might help explain a OS problem. Depending on what if your Linux team or your Windows team is doing their own monitoring, that might be helpful or not, just kind of depends. It also checks, one really great thing about DB check is, or I'm sorry, or check, is it also checks the OS system for OS patches or for OS settings that could be correct. So for instance, some things that might always recommend, so you want to, again, all this should be done through analysis. So you're putting this into a report. You don't want to just cut and paste these things because sometimes it's appropriate, sometimes it's not. Oracle Clusterware is not being used. I mean, that's okay. That's all right. It's not a rack system. It's a VirtualBox. So it's not surprising that something wouldn't be set like that. And then it goes through and basically provides sort of the same detail you see in other reports. I think that's it for this. I think I'll stop that share and go back to the presentation real quick. Okay, so we've been through our examples. Hopefully you can see the screen again. And again, final thoughts. Health checks are an important component of proactive organization. If you find it difficult for you to do these with in-house DBAs, you can use an outsourcer, or like I say, these tools will also help you. It's just really helpful process that you will find yourself referring to in the future. So some of the connection information I mentioned I was going to go through later. You can tweet or use Facebook, connect to the New York Oracle users group in all these different ways. There's the Oracle user community website right there. So you can follow that link and it will take you to there. I think that's what I had.
Great, thank you, Zane. Make sure everyone fills out the cloud adoption survey. Link is in the chat for you. Make sure you get those in today so that we can select a winner in the next day or so. Let's open it up for Q&A here. As a reminder, the Q&A panel is down at the bottom of your screen. So go ahead and submit your questions that way. Zane, it does look like there's one there if you want to take a look at it.
Yep, that was, does Statspack require a Oracle license? And is no, it is included every time. So it is not installed automatically. You do have to go create a perfstat table space. You run the SP create to create that account or create that process, and SP snap. Just look on, basically Google search for Statspack and how to install it will be pretty obvious. The additionally, the Statspack doesn't come with a cleanup feature, so you want to make sure that you include a job that also cleans up old snapshots. Otherwise, it can slowly take over your storage. I can't see the link in the chat.
I'm re-adding it for you now. Give me just a minute. Thanks for bringing that attention. Bring it to my attention. Oh, Zoom is slow today. Maybe it's me. Okay, let me know if you can see that. That should be in the chat screen. It's a techvalidate.com/registration. All right, he's got it. Go ahead and fill that out. Let's see, are there any more questions? Maybe just give it another minute. Then everybody can get a hold of their link too. It's a quiet group today. We were hoping for hard questions. Well, Zane was. No?
Yep, thanks everybody for attending, and we do have other events coming up, including Oracle OEM options and in memory, I believe.
Yes,
sure
absolutely. We've got another one with NYOUG, May 11th is our next one. Or no, we have two more. We have another one for Oracle to AWS. So check out, yes, check out datavail.com. Like I said, fill out your cloud survey, and we'll send out this recording as soon as it's available. Thank you to NYOUG for sponsoring this. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.